Imagine a quiet coastal village, its pier weathered by time and the sea. Now add a mysterious death, a curse that haunts the town, and a cast of townsfolk each guarding their own secrets. In Shadows Over Harrowpoint Pier, the truth is buried beneath layers of fear, betrayal, and history long forgotten. Get comfortable. This story will lead you through the fog and keep you guessing until the very last twist. The salt of the sea clung to the air like a heavy blanket as Harriet Lowe stepped off the rickety bus, her boots crunching on the gravel road. The wind, sharp and unrelenting, carried the scent of brine and damp wood. It was a stark contrast to the constant hum of city life she was used to, a life where the buzz of traffic and the clatter of busy cafes were more familiar than the eerie silence that now surrounded her. Harrowpoint felt as though it had been forgotten by time. The narrow, winding streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of seabirds overhead. The coastal town seemed suspended in an unsettling stillness, as though the world beyond its crumbling pier had moved on without it. The buildings stood hunched against the weather, their faded facades bearing the scars of many storms. A small, almost pitiful collection of fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, their owners nowhere to be seen. Harriet, a marine biologist by trade, had come here for a simple purpose: to study the declining fish populations that were wreaking havoc on the local fishing industry. The irony of it wasn't lost on her. An expert in marine ecosystems was now tasked with investigating the death of a once thriving industry. Yet, as she looked out across the water, the uneasy feeling gnawing at her stomach suggested that there was more to Harrowpoint than she had anticipated. The Harrowpoint Inn was a modest establishment nestled on the edge of the village, its timber frame sagging beneath the weight of years of neglect. Harriet had booked a room, her decision motivated as much by the need for solitude as by the inn's proximity to the pier. She'd read nothing particularly noteworthy about the town in her initial research, but something, perhaps the weathered postcard she'd received from a colleague, had piqued her interest. The fact that her grant was tied to this place felt more like fate than coincidence. The innkeeper, Lydia Morgan, was a woman of few words, but the brief exchange in the lobby left Harriet with a sense of guarded caution. Lydia had led her to her room without much more than a perfunctory greeting. Her demeanor was calm, yet there was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear, perhaps, that Harriet couldn't shake. When the subject of the pier came up in passing, Lydia's face grew taut, as if the mere mention of it caused her discomfort. It was subtle, easily overlooked by someone less perceptive, but Harriet's trained eye caught it. The room itself was small but cozy, its decor old-fashioned and faded, much like the town itself. The windows, which overlooked the pier, were veiled with a thin film of salt. Harriet opened them, allowing the fresh sea air to flood in, but the scent it carried was more unsettling than she had expected. It wasn't just the smell of salt water. There was something else, a hint of decay, as if the sea had slowly been reclaiming the village. After settling in, Harriet ventured out to explore. The main street was deserted, the buildings hunched like old men watching the tide. As she passed by the harbor, she caught sight of an elderly man sitting on a weather-beaten bench near the edge of the pier. His features were weathered and tired, and as his eyes met hers, there was a knowing look in them, a look that suggested he had seen far too much over the years. Harriet forced herself to smile, but the man's gaze lingered longer than usual, his eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair as she made her way back toward the inn. As she turned a corner, she heard voices, low and conspiratorial, coming from the alley between the inn and a nearby pub. She paused, instinctively drawn to the sound. Lydia's voice was unmistakable, but it was accompanied by another, deeper voice, one that rasped with age and authority. Harriet stayed just out of sight, her curiosity piqued. "I don't know, Ezra," Lydia said, her voice shaking slightly. "She's asking too many questions. It's not like before. We can't risk it." Ezra, Captain Ezra Ward, if Harriet recalled correctly, responded with a gravelly chuckle. "The curse doesn't care who asks the questions, Lydia. It never has. If she's digging, she'll find what she finds, but it's better she leaves soon. These things, they're not for outsiders to understand." The conversation ended there, and Harriet was left standing in the shadows, unsettled by the exchange. The curse. The words hung in the air like a thick fog. She had heard mention of it earlier from a local fisherman, but it had seemed like nothing more than folklore. But there, in the alleyway, it felt real, ominous even. Lydia's nervousness wasn't just a sign of the typical guardedness of small-town folk. There was something deeper, something she was afraid to speak of aloud. The next few hours passed uneventfully. Harriet retired early, knowing that the next few days would demand her full attention as she began her research. But just as she was about to fall into a fitful sleep, a loud commotion outside jolted her awake. She rushed to the window and looked out at the pier. The moonlight reflected off the water, and Harriet could see figures moving in the distance, shadows darting back and forth with urgency. Her heart raced as she grabbed her jacket and hurried down to the inn's front door. She opened it to find a small group of people gathered near the end of the pier. Constable Alan Pierce was among them, his face tight with concern, his posture rigid as he spoke in low tones to the others. Harriet could hear snippets of conversation. Tangled in his nets. Doesn't make sense. It's the curse. It's happening again. The words struck her with force. The curse. But this time, the whispering townsfolk weren't speaking of it in passing. They were acknowledging it. A fisherman was dead, tangled in his own nets, and the curse had reared its ugly head once again. As Harriet stood at the door, her mind racing, she overheard Lydia's voice among the murmurs, low and strained. "It's starting again, Captain, just like before." The undercurrent of dread in her words was undeniable. Harriet's pulse quickened as she realized that somehow she had stepped into something far darker than she had expected. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft light over Harrowpoint as Harriet made her way to the small weathered shop where Captain Ezra Ward spent his mornings. The air was thick with the lingering scent of the sea, and the town still seemed caught in a half-sleep, wrapped in the quiet of early morning. Harriet's thoughts, however, were far from restful. The previous night's events, the whispered talk of the curse, and the unsettling death of Owen Blay churned in her mind like the restless waves. She arrived at the shop, a simple building that looked as though it had withstood many storms. Captain Ward was behind the counter, his rough hands sorting through a pile of old maps and fishing gear. The shop was dim, the wooden beams sagging beneath the weight of decades of neglect, but it had a certain charm, one that spoke of years of fishing and local lore. Ward looked up as she entered, his sharp, weathered eyes appraising her before he offered a quiet nod. "I suppose you want to know about the curse," he said, as though he had been expecting her. Harriet hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. She had heard enough rumors and whispers in the town to know that the curse wasn't just a story, but something people truly believed in, something that seemed to weigh heavily on their collective conscience. "Yes," Harriet replied, keeping her voice neutral. "What exactly is it?" Ward's gaze grew distant, as if the memory of the curse itself carried a burden too heavy to bear. He paused for a moment before speaking, his voice low and gravely. "Years ago, a ship went down in these waters," he began, his fingers tracing the edges of a map laid out on the counter. The Larkspur was its name, an old schooner. It was carrying a cargo of valuables. Rumors say it was something much darker, smuggled goods, if you believe the stories. Whatever it was, the ship went down in a storm. The wreck's been sitting at the bottom of the bay ever since. Some say the wrecked ship left a curse behind. A curse that claims a life every 10 years. The last time it happened was 20 years ago. And now it's come back. Harriet felt a chill creep up her spine as she listened. The story was steeped in superstition, yet something in Ward's tone, something in the way he said it, made her uneasy. "Do you believe it?" she asked, her voice steady, though her mind raced. Ward's eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment she saw something in them. Something ancient and weary. "Does it matter what I believe?" he replied softly. "The people here, they do, and that's enough." Harriet studied his face, the hard lines that spoke of years of hardship, both on the sea and in life. There was a hint of something more, something unsaid behind his words, but Ward offered no further explanation. "I suppose you won't tell me more," Harriet said, trying to mask her growing frustration. Ward's lips curled into a half-smile, but there was no humor in it. Some things are better left undisturbed, Miss Lowe. The past has a way of keeping its secrets. As she left the shop, Harriet felt an unsettling sense of being watched. The townspeople had spoken of the curse in whispers, but there was something in the way they spoke, something that told her they weren't just afraid, they were afraid of the truth. The rest of the morning passed in a haze, Harriet's thoughts still revolving around the curse and Ward's cryptic warnings. She tried to focus on her research, but the undercurrent of fear in the town was hard to ignore. As the day wore on, she decided to visit Owen Blaye's widow, Emma, hoping to learn more about the man's life and his possible connection to the mystery surrounding the pier. Emma Blaye's cottage was small and simple, nestled at the edge of the village. The windows were tightly shut and the door was cracked open just enough for Harriet to knock. After a long pause, Emma appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale and drawn. She looked fragile, as if she might crumble under the weight of her grief. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Blaye," Harriet began, her voice gentle. "I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your husband, about Owen." Emma's gaze flickered briefly to the ground before she stepped back to let Harriet inside. There was a coldness in the air, the cottage more stifling than Harriet had expected. The smell of mildew mixed with something else, something sharper, more unsettling. Emma led her to a small sitting room. The furniture was sparse, but photographs of Owen and his family lined the walls. In the center of the room was a rocking chair, its creaking sound almost deafening in the silence. "He was a good man," Emma said quietly, sitting on the edge of the chair. "He didn't deserve to die like that." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she quickly composed herself. "He had his secrets, though, things he wouldn't talk about." Harriet leaned forward slightly, her professional curiosity piqued. "Secrets? What kind of secrets?" Emma's eyes darted nervously to the window, then back to Harriet. "I don't know," she said quickly, her voice low. "I don't want to know. Just leave it alone, Miss Lowe, for your own sake." Harriet stood, unsure of how to respond. The fear in Emma's eyes was palpable, but it was a fear that seemed to go beyond grief. There was something darker there, something that suggested Emma knew more than she was letting on. Before she could probe further, Emma rose abruptly. "Please, I don't want to talk about him anymore," she whispered, almost pleading. Harriet hesitated but nodded. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you." As she left the cottage, her mind swirled with the unspoken words that hung in the air. Owen Blaye had secrets. Of that, Harriet was certain. But what kind of secrets? And how deep did they run? Later, near the harbor, Harriet decided to inspect the nets where Owen had been found. She walked along the pier, the wooden planks creaking beneath her feet, and saw the discarded nets strewn across the ground. The smell of fish and seaweed clung to the air, mixing with the scent of something more metallic, something that caught her attention. Buried within the tangled mess of nets, Harriet found something small and unusual. It was a brass key, its surface worn and aged, etched with strange symbols that seemed to shift under the light. She studied it carefully, unable to make sense of it, but instinctively she knew it was important. A piece of the puzzle, waiting to be discovered. As she pocketed the key, Harriet couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her from the shadows of the pier. She turned quickly, but saw nothing, just the dimming light of dusk and the quiet lapping of the waves against the shore. The wind had picked up again, swirling the salty air into Harriet's face as she walked back along the pier, the brass key still heavy in her pocket. Her mind was swirling with questions, and the faces of the townsfolk kept flashing in her thoughts, each one harboring secrets they were reluctant to share. There was no doubt in Harriet's mind now. Owen's death was no accident. Something much darker was at play in Harrowpoint, and the key she had found was just the beginning of unraveling the town's tangled web. Her first stop was the Blaye cottage. The door creaked open slowly, and Emma Blaye's pale face appeared, her eyes still shadowed by grief. Harriet hesitated, unsure if she should push any further, but Emma's fragile demeanor made it impossible not to feel sympathy. Yet something in the air, an unspoken tension, told Harriet there was more to Emma than the grieving widow she appeared to be. "I'm sorry to trouble you again," Harriet said softly, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. Emma's eyes darted nervously toward the window, and she stiffened as if sensing someone's presence outside, though no one was there. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "I told you last time, Miss Lowe, please, don't ask about Owen's past. It's not something you want to know." Harriet kept her expression neutral, though a growing sense of unease settled in her stomach. "I understand, but the more I learn about Owen, the more I realize he wasn't just the fisherman you remember. There's something more. Something tied to the pier. Isn't there?" Emma's eyes flickered again, this time lingering on the window, as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. "I don't know anything about that," she said quickly, her voice shaking with the effort. "You should leave it alone, Miss Lowe. There's nothing you can do. It's better if you don't know." The urgency in her voice was unmistakable, and for a moment Harriet thought Emma might collapse under the weight of her own fears. But then Emma stepped back, allowing Harriet to leave without further resistance. As Harriet stepped outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, perhaps someone who was hidden just out of sight. She turned her attention toward the next person on her list, Graham Cross. Cross was a large man with broad shoulders, the kind of man whose presence could dominate a room. His rough hands were calloused from years of hard labor, and his face was weathered like someone who had spent too many years fighting against the sea. Harriet found him at the local pub, sitting at the bar, nursing a drink as though trying to drown some inner storm. He glanced up as she entered, his eyes narrowing as though he recognized her, though there was no warmth in his gaze. "What do you want, Miss Lowe?" he asked bluntly, his voice rough from years of shouting over the roar of the waves. "I wanted to ask about Owen," Harriet said, her tone casual, though she was keenly aware of the tension in the air between them. "I understand you two had a business arrangement." Cross's expression darkened at the mention of Owen's name. "Had," he muttered under his breath. "Past tense. We had a business arrangement, yeah, but that's over now. Doesn't matter anymore." His hands tightened around his glass, the knuckles whitening, and for a moment, Harriet thought he might crush the drink in his hand. "You didn't get along in the end?" Harriet pressed, her eyes studying his face for any sign of emotion. His eyes avoided hers, focusing instead on the amber liquid in his glass. "Does it matter? We had a falling out, that's all." Business went sour. You know how these things go. But Harriet wasn't convinced. She had seen the flicker of resentment in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he spoke of Owen. There was more to their relationship than just a failed business venture. She leaned in slightly, her voice softening. "Was Owen's research into the shipwreck something that concerned you?" Cross's head snapped up and his eyes met hers for the first time, a flash of anger crossing his face. "You've been talking to Ward, haven't you?" he growled, his voice rising. "I told that old fool to keep his mouth shut. It's all nonsense, all of it. Those stories about the curse, they're nothing but fairy tales. And as for Owen, he was no saint, but he didn't deserve to die like that." The outburst was sharp, and for a moment the tension in the air was thick enough to cut through. Harriet could sense the heat of the anger in Graham's words, but she also saw something more, something hidden beneath the surface, something personal. His gaze had hardened, and she could tell that whatever had transpired between him and Owen was far from settled. "Do you think the curse is real?" Harriet asked, testing the waters, though she already suspected the answer. Graham's eyes flared with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "No," he spat. "I don't believe in curses. I believe in money. I believe in what I can see with my own two eyes. And right now, all I see is a bunch of superstitious fools spinning yarns to distract themselves from what really happened." Harriet stood up, feeling the weight of the conversation settle around her. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Cross," she said, though her mind was already turning over the pieces of their conversation. Her next stop was the small artist's studio by the pier, where Daisy Hart spent most of her time. Daisy had a reputation for being reclusive, and from what Harriet had gathered, she rarely spoke to anyone about anything. But Harriet had noticed the way Daisy's eyes had darted away when the subject of Owen's death came up, and she suspected there was more to the quiet artist than met the eye. The studio was a small, cramped space filled with canvases, sketches, and paints. Daisy was seated at a cluttered table, her eyes focused on a sketch she was working on, her hands moving with a practiced fluidity. She didn't acknowledge Harriet's presence at first, absorbed in her work. After a moment, Harriet cleared her throat, and Daisy looked up, her pale face expressionless. "I didn't expect you," Daisy said, her voice soft but carrying a note of wariness. Harriet smiled, trying to put the young woman at ease. "I wanted to ask you about the night Owen died. I understand you were near his boat." Daisy's expression tightened, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I didn't see anything," she said quickly, her words almost too fast, as though she were trying to convince herself more than Harriet. Harriet studied her for a moment, noting the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly. "You mentioned seeing someone near the boat. Can you tell me who it was?" Daisy's eyes flickered, her gaze darting toward the window as if she were considering whether to speak. Finally, she sighed and leaned back in her chair, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw a figure, but I didn't get a good look at them. They were just there, watching. Near the water. It was strange." Harriet's instincts told her Daisy wasn't telling the whole truth, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. Daisy was hiding something, perhaps even trying to protect someone. Harriet let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. "I understand," Harriet said softly, "but if you know anything at all, it could help." Daisy hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know anything. I swear." Harriet gave her a small nod, sensing that Daisy had reached the limit of what she was willing to reveal. She stood up, glancing around the room, then headed for the door. "Thank you, Daisy. I'll leave you to your work." The door closed behind her, but as Harriet walked toward the inn, her mind was already working through the information she had gathered. Each conversation had revealed something new, but nothing yet had given her the clarity she needed. All she knew for certain was that the townsfolk of Harrowpoint were hiding something dark and dangerous, and Harriet was determined to find out what it was. Her last stop of the day was Dr. Victor Hale's office. The physician was another puzzle, and Harriet could sense that he too was keeping secrets. She had heard nothing of him being involved in the town's history or the shipwreck, but there was a quiet unease in his manner that made her uneasy. "Doctor." Hale greeted her with a calm, almost mechanical politeness, and his demeanor was as controlled as ever. He didn't show the same openness as the other suspects, his eyes distant and calculating. When asked about his late-night house calls, he grew momentarily tense, his voice slipping into an almost imperceptible pitch. "I deal with what comes to me," he said, his gaze avoiding hers. "Sometimes people need help at odd hours." Harriet noticed the slight twitch in his hand as he reached for his pen. It was subtle, but it was there. Something about his response didn't sit right, but Harriet knew better than to push him too far too quickly. "Thank you for your time, Doctor," she said, sensing that she had reached the end of this conversation. As Harriet left the physician's office, her thoughts swirled with the fragments of information she had gathered. Each conversation had brought her closer to the heart of the mystery, but there was still a sense of something she was missing. The brass key, the curse, the strained relationships, everything pointed to something much larger than just a fisherman's death. Harriet was determined to find out what it was, no matter the cost. The following day, Harriet stood on the pier, the cool wind biting at her skin, her mind heavy with the discoveries she'd made so far. The conversations with the townsfolk had only deepened the mystery, but no one had revealed anything truly useful. Just cryptic hints and fractured stories. Every time she thought she was getting closer to the truth, another piece of the puzzle slipped through her fingers. She was about to turn back to the inn when her foot caught on something half buried in the sand. She knelt, brushing away the loose grains, and unearthed a small, weathered scrap of paper. It was a fragment of a map torn along its edges, but the markings were unmistakable, an X drawn with a shaky hand and a faint line leading to the pier. Harriet's breath caught in her throat. The map wasn't just old, it was connected to the key she had found. The brass key felt heavier in her pocket now, as if it were waiting for her to decipher its meaning. She looked out across the water, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the shipwreck Captain Ward had mentioned. But the sea was still, an unnerving calm settling over it, as if the past was holding its breath. Harriet could feel the weight of the town's history pressing in on her, and the discovery of the map fragment only deepened her sense of urgency. Someone had wanted to keep Owen quiet. Had it been connected to the shipwreck or something far worse? As she made her way back to the inn, Harriet's mind raced. She needed to find out more about the town's history, the shipwreck, and the map. And then there was Daisy Hart, who was becoming more intriguing by the day. Something in the young woman's behavior, the way she had hesitated when speaking of Owen, the fear she couldn't quite mask, suggested that Daisy knew more than she was letting on. Harriet had to find a way to get her to talk. That afternoon, she stopped by Daisy's studio once more. The door was ajar, and Harriet pushed it open gently. Daisy was at her table, sketching something with quick, precise strokes. She didn't look up as Harriet entered. "I've been thinking," Harriet began, her voice casual but laced with an undertone of resolve. "About your sketches? I noticed that some of them are of Owen's boat. You said you saw something that night. Would you be willing to show me more?" Daisy paused, her pencil hovering above the paper for a moment before she set it down and looked up at Harriet. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or guilt, but it was quickly masked by her usual calm. "I told you before," Daisy said, her voice quieter now. "I don't know much. Just that I saw someone near the boat." Harriet stepped closer, trying to soften her approach. "I understand, Daisy, but you're the only one who might have seen something that could explain what happened to Owen. Please, let me help you." Daisy looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling as she slowly opened her sketchbook. She flipped through a few pages until she reached a series of drawings of Owen's boat, the pier, and the town's coastline. As Harriet leaned in to examine the sketches, she noticed that some of the symbols in the drawings matched those on the brass key. There was no mistaking it. The designs in Daisy's sketches were far too specific to be mere coincidence. "These symbols," Harriet said softly, pointing to one drawing, "they look like the ones on the key I found. Do you recognize them?" Daisy hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know. I draw what I see." She looked up then, her gaze intense, almost pleading. "I don't want to be involved in any of this. It's dangerous." Harriet studied her, sensing the fear beneath Daisy's words. The young woman was hiding something, but she wasn't ready to share it yet. "You're already involved, whether you want to be or not," Harriet replied gently. "I need you to trust me, Daisy. I won't let anything happen to you, but I need to understand what happened the night Owen died." Daisy's eyes darted toward the window, as if she were afraid someone might be watching. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was someone near the boat that night, but I couldn't see who it was. I saw them standing by the water, but they didn't move. They just watched. I don't know why they were there, but I know it wasn't good. I didn't tell anyone because I was afraid." Harriet nodded, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Someone had been watching Owen that night, someone who hadn't wanted to be seen. She pressed a bit further. "Did you recognize the figure? Did they seem familiar?" Daisy shook her head quickly. No, I didn't get a good look. It was dark, and there was a fog rolling in. I didn't want to get involved. I don't want to get in trouble." Harriet gave her a reassuring smile, though her thoughts were already on the next step. Daisy knew something, but the young artist wasn't ready to say more. Harriet would have to find another way to uncover the truth. As she left the studio, the fog began to roll in across the harbor, thickening the air and clouding her vision. The town seemed even more isolated now, the streets quiet, the only sound the lapping of the waves against the pier. Harriet's instincts told her that something was about to happen, something that would push her closer to the truth. That night, as the fog grew denser, Harriet stood at the window of her room, watching the pier. There was something about the stillness that felt wrong, as if the town was holding its breath. The air grew colder, and Harriet pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out onto the porch. The fog had swallowed the pier whole, leaving only a dim outline in the distance. She walked closer to the pier, her footsteps muffled by the thick fog. The quiet seemed suffocating, and the shadows danced on the edge of her vision, making her feel as though she were being watched. And then, just as she reached the end of the pier, she saw a figure. a silhouette slipping silently between the old wooden posts, moving with the same eerie quiet that the fog seemed to bring. Harriet froze. Her heart pounded as she watched the figure disappear into the mist. She wanted to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. Whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be here. Not now, not with the fog so thick. She took a hesitant step forward, but the figure had already vanished, leaving only the shifting shadows behind. Someone was watching her. And whoever it was, they knew something she had yet to uncover. The morning was thick with fog, heavier than it had been in days, as Harriet made her way toward Daisy Hart's studio. The town had taken on an eerie quiet, the only sounds the distant calls of seagulls and the occasional creak of the aging buildings that line the main street. The fog clung to everything, shrouding the town in a sense of timelessness, as though Harrowpoint were suspended between past and present, unable to escape its history. Harriet had barely slept the night before, her thoughts consumed by the cryptic words Daisy had left behind in her sketches. The symbols, the figure by the boat, the fog. It all felt connected, but to what, she couldn't yet say. She needed to speak with Daisy again, push her for more answers, but as she reached the artist's studio, something about the scene stopped her in her tracks. The door was ajar, slightly off its hinges. A chill ran down Harriet's spine, and she hesitated before stepping inside. The familiar scent of paints and canvas filled the air, but there was something off, a feeling that she couldn't shake. She stepped further into the studio, her eyes scanning the room. Daisy's body was slumped against the wall, her face pale and lifeless. She was still holding the pencil she had been using earlier, her final sketch pinned to the easel in front of her. Harriet's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer. The sketch was unmistakable. The pier, the water, the same symbols Daisy had drawn before, but this time there were words scrawled in large, erratic letters. Find the truth. Harriet's heart hammered in her chest. The words seemed to echo in her ears, a clear message left behind by the young artist. But what truth? And who had silenced her before she could finish speaking? She knelt beside Daisy's body, her mind racing. There were no signs of physical injury, no obvious cause of death. But Harriet had seen enough to know that this wasn't an accident. Daisy had been killed for what she knew, for what she was about to reveal. The same forces that had claimed Owen's life were now at work again. Harriet's hand trembled as she reached for her phone to call the constable. As she lifted it to her ear, her eyes fell on a drawer in the far corner of the room, half open. She could just make out the edges of something, papers, perhaps, a journal. Her instincts kicked in. She had to find out what Daisy knew, what she had uncovered. Ignoring the urge to step away from the body, Harriet moved toward the drawer, pulling it open with careful hands. Inside, she found an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. It looked out of place, as if it had been hidden here for years. She opened the journal, the pages yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, but the words were clear. The wreck is not what they say. The ship, the Larkspur, was carrying more than just cargo. It was carrying secrets, dark secrets. The men who survived the storm are not innocent. The ship's captain knew what was coming. They betrayed us, and now they are paying the price. This town is cursed, and when the time comes, the truth will be revealed. But not until it's too late. Harriet's stomach twisted as she read the words, her mind working furiously to piece together what she had learned. The journal was written by the captain of the Larkspur, the same ship that had gone down all those years ago. And the betrayal it described, what was it? Had the ship been involved in smuggling? Had the wreck been more than just an accident? The pieces were starting to fit together, but the puzzle was far from complete. And now Daisy was dead, silenced before she could finish what Owen had started. Harriet could feel the weight of the town's history pressing in on her, suffocating her with its secrets. She needed to know more, but the danger was real. Whoever was trying to keep these secrets buried was willing to kill to protect them. As Harriet turned to leave the studio, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Constable Pierce. "Miss Lowe," his voice was strained. "We've found something you need to see. You should come to the pier." Harriet's heart skipped a beat. She knew this wasn't just another fishing accident, not now. Whatever had happened to Daisy, it was connected to the same forces at work in the town, and the answers were just beyond her reach. The walk to the pier felt longer than it should have, the fog still thick and oppressive, as though the town itself was trying to keep her from uncovering the truth. By the time she arrived, a small crowd had gathered, murmurs running through the group like an electric current. Constable Pierce was standing apart from the others, his face tight with frustration. "Miss Lowe?" he said as she approached. "I didn't want you to find out this way, but it seems we've stumbled upon something bigger than we thought." Harriet's stomach churned. "What is it?" Pierce gestured to the water, where something large and dark had been pulled from the depths. Harriet's breath caught in her throat as she saw the unmistakable shape of a boat that looked eerily like Owen's. "It's Owen's boat," Pierce said grimly. "It's been sitting at the bottom of the harbor all this time. Someone didn't want us to find it." Harriet stepped closer, her pulse quickening. There in the shallow water, Owen's boat was half submerged, the hull cracked and weathered. But that wasn't what caught her attention. There, tied to the boat's side, was a small brass plaque, partially obscured by the barnacles that had accumulated over the years. It had the same symbols she had seen on the quay. The connections were clear now. Owen had been getting too close to the truth, and someone had gone to great lengths to silence him and Daisy. The shipwreck wasn't just a piece of history. It was a living, breathing part of the town's dark secrets, and Harriet was right in the middle of it all. But the danger was escalating. Someone had tampered with her research equipment the night before, a warning to stop asking questions. And now, with the discovery of the boat, Harriet knew there was no turning back. She was in this, whether she wanted to be or not. The truth was just beyond her reach, but with every step she took, the risk of finding it grew more dangerous. The fog had settled even heavier over Harrowpoint by the time Harriet returned to the inn. The town seemed almost suffocated by it, its streets and buildings swallowed up, leaving the narrow path between the village and the sea feeling like a labyrinth. Harriet's thoughts were a tangled mess of facts and suspicions, each thread leading her closer to something dangerous, something much darker than she had anticipated when she first arrived. The deaths of Owen Blay and Daisy Hart were not isolated incidents. They were pieces of a puzzle, and Harriet was determined to find the missing ones. The journal, the brass key, the map, each clue was pointing in one direction, and the further she dug, the more it seemed that Harrowpoint itself was complicit in a history that no one wanted to acknowledge. The shipwreck, the supposed curse, the betrayal. It all fit together like a sordid tale of greed and revenge. Her first stop was Emma Blay's cottage, where the widow had been an enigma ever since their first meeting. Harriet had learned that Emma knew more than she let on, but each time the conversation pushed closer to the truth, Emma became more distant, more guarded. Today, however, something in Harriet's gut told her that the woman might be ready to crack. The cottage door opened with a quiet creak, and Emma stepped into view. Her expression was even more drawn than it had been before, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. But today, there was something different in her demeanor, something colder, more distant. "I need to speak with you," Harriet said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been piecing things together, Emma. There's more to Owen's death than just a drowning." Emma flinched, her hands twitching at her sides. "I told you before, Miss Lowe, you need to stop digging into his past. It won't bring him back." Harriet studied her, sensing the defensive wall Emma had put up. There was something in the woman's eyes, something that screamed of a hidden truth, and it was only a matter of time before that truth would come spilling out. "Owen was blackmailing someone," Harriet said, her tone gentle but direct. "Was it you? Did he threaten you, Emma?" Emma's face went pale, her lips parting as if to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, after a long pause, she let out a shuddering breath. "I don't know who it was," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "He never told me, but I could see it in his eyes. He was afraid. He said he had something on someone, something important. He was going to expose them, Harriet. He didn't tell me who, but he was scared. He said it was all connected to the shipwreck." Harriet leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What was connected to the shipwreck?" Emma shook her head violently, as though the words themselves could hurt her. He wouldn't say, but the way he looked at me, it was like he knew I already knew. He was going to leave, Harriet. He was going to get out of here, but he never had the chance. Emma's eyes flickered nervously toward the window. I don't know anything more, I swear. Harriet stood there, her mind racing. It was clear Emma was hiding something. She could feel it in the woman's shaky hands, in the way she hesitated to meet Harriet's gaze. But was Emma guilty, or was she simply caught in the crossfire of a much larger and more dangerous plot? The pieces were becoming clearer, but Harriet wasn't sure if she could trust Emma's words. "One last thing," Harriet said. "Who else could have known about Owen's research? Who would have had the most to lose if he exposed them?" Emma's lips pressed tightly together. She glanced out the window again, as though waiting for something or someone to appear. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just one person. It's more than that. The town is full of secrets. The people here, they've all got their hands in the past. Some things are better left buried, Miss Lowe. Some things are better forgotten." Harriet knew then that Emma knew far more than she was willing to admit. But the conversation was over for now. There would be no more answers from her, not today. As Harriet turned to leave, she felt a shiver crawl down her spine. She had no idea what Emma had meant by her cryptic words, but the warning was clear. Harrowpoint was a town built on secrets, and it would go to great lengths to protect them. The day dragged on, each moment feeling heavier than the last. Harriet spent the rest of the afternoon trying to piece together what she had learned. Her thoughts kept returning to the larkspur, to the shipwreck that had set everything into motion. Was the curse just folklore, or was it a symbol of something deeper, something tied to the greed and betrayal of the town's ancestors? Her mind was still whirling when she returned to the inn that evening. She had just begun to unpack her notes when the distinct feeling that something was wrong settled over her like a heavy fog. Her research equipment, the very tools she had used to catalog her findings, had been tampered with, scattered across the desk, some cables pulled loose, a few of her files missing. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Someone didn't want her to keep digging. Someone was watching her. She knew she was getting closer to something, but the price for that knowledge was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Harriet quickly gathered what she could salvage, her mind racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until she was silenced. The deaths, the threats, the warnings, it was all connected. And now, with her equipment destroyed, Harriet knew there was no turning back. She was on the verge of uncovering something much larger than she had anticipated, something buried in the history of Harrowpoint, but someone was desperate to keep it hidden. That night, as Harriet made her way back to her room, the dim light from the street lamps flickered out in the distance. The fog had rolled back in, even thicker than before, and the air felt damp with tension. As she walked down the narrow lane, she suddenly heard a sound behind her, a footstep, too heavy to be just a shadow in the mist. Before she could react, something sharp struck the back of her head, sending her crashing to the ground. Her vision blurred, the world spinning as she fought to stay conscious. A shadow loomed over her, a figure in the mist. Harriet tried to reach for her phone, but her body was too slow, too weak. The figure paused, as if considering something, and then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished into the fog, leaving Harriet lying in the street, breathless and terrified. The storm that had brewed over Harrowpoint for days had finally broken. The rain, which had pounded the town relentlessly through the night, had slowed to a gentle drizzle, leaving the air thick with moisture. The fog, too, had receded, though its presence still lingered in the corners of the village. Harriet stood in the small dining room of Harrowpoint Inn, looking out at the quiet street. She had gathered the suspects, all of them, under one roof for the final confrontation. It was time to end this. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and turned to face the group that had assembled in the dimly lit room. Lydia Morgan, Captain Ezra Ward, Constable Alan Pierce, Emma Blay, Graham Cross, and Dr. Victor Hale were all present. Their faces ranged from nervous to defiant, but each one shared a common trait: fear. Fear of the truth that was about to come crashing down on them. "Thank you all for coming," Harriet said calmly, her voice clear and steady. She was in control now. every word calculated and measured. "I know the last few days have been difficult, but I believe it's time we put an end to this." She moved toward the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over each of them. The deaths of Owen Blay and Daisy Hart were not random tragedies. They were murders, and they were murders tied to something much darker, a secret that has been buried in this town for decades. Harriet paused, allowing her words to sink in. She could see the tension building, the unease spreading like wildfire among the group. But she wasn't done yet. Owen Blay was blackmailing someone, she continued, someone with a deep connection to the shipwreck, the Larkspur. It wasn't just an accident, not a simple tragedy. The shipwreck was the beginning of a long series of betrayals, greed, and corruption, and Owen uncovered something that threatened to expose it all. She turned to Emma Blay. "Your husband, Emma, was afraid of what he had found, and afraid of who might be after him. But he couldn't stay quiet. He was going to leave Harrowpoint, take the money he had earned from his research, and disappear, but someone couldn't let that happen." Harriet's gaze shifted to Dr. Victor Hale. The physician stood tall, his usual calm demeanor replaced with an almost palpable unease. It was clear to Harriet now that he was the key to everything. "The killer," Harriet said, her voice firm, "is Dr. Victor Hale." The room went still. Dr. Hale's face turned an ashen color, and for the first time his mask of control slipped. He opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped, his eyes flickering toward the others in the room, his silence betraying his guilt. Harriet pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "Years ago, Dr. Hale's family was involved in smuggling through the wreck of the Larkspur. The ship was carrying valuable goods, but it was also carrying betrayal. Hale's family had a hand in that betrayal, and when Owen started to uncover the truth, he began blackmailing him. Owen threatened to expose Hale's past, and that's why he had to die." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. "And Daisy Hart, she was killed because she got too close. She saw something in Owen's research, and her sketches revealed more than she realized. She was murdered to keep her quiet." Dr. Hale finally spoke, his voice a low rasp. "You don't understand," he said, his hands trembling at his sides. "My family didn't have a choice. It was all about survival. The wreck, the cargo, it was everything. Owen, he didn't understand what he was getting into." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the others. "I couldn't let him destroy everything we built. The town, it was never supposed to know." Harriet's eyes never left him. "You killed Owen to protect your secret, and Daisy because she was getting too close to the truth. You thought you could control the past, but in the end, it's always the truth that comes out." A moment of silence passed before Constable Pierce stepped forward, his expression stern but resolute. "Dr. Hale, you're under arrest for the murders of Owen Blay and Daisy Hart. You have the right to remain silent." The constable's words faded as Dr. Hale was escorted out of the room, but Harriet's mind was still reeling from the unraveling of it all. The town's dark history, the betrayal, the greed, it was all there, hidden beneath layers of fear and superstition. The so-called curse of Harrowpoint was nothing more than a veil of fear, a cover for the sins of the past that no one wanted to face. As the room began to empty, Harriet stood in silence, her thoughts reflecting on the events that had led her here. The town of Harrowpoint was left to grapple with the truth. No more secrets, no more shadows. It was over. The storm had cleared, the skies now brightening as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds. The air was fresh, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the town for so long seemed to lift with the dawn. Harriet stood on the pier looking out at the calm water. The Larkspur had been nothing more than a symbol of the town's greed, a reminder of the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. But now, with the truth exposed, it no longer had power over Harrowpoint. She thought of the townspeople, their fear, their complicity in the past, and how for all the darkness, they now had a chance to rebuild. The curse, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. As Harriet turned to leave Harrowpoint, the quiet village behind her seemed like a different place. The fog had lifted, and so had the veil of secrecy. She felt a sense of relief, but also of loss. Sometimes the truth could be freeing, but it could also tear things apart. The road ahead was uncertain, but Harriet knew that the town would now have to face the consequences of its actions. She had done her part. The mystery had been solved, and as she stepped into the waiting car, ready to leave Harrowpoint behind, she couldn't help but reflect on the dangers of greed, the power of fear, and how the past always had a way of catching up with those who tried to bury it. The larkspur had sunk, but the truth had risen.